Hello. Today I'm here to talk to you about World War II and the true story of how librarians saved the world and invented modern spycraft. The amazing thing about this story is that it really did happen. The OSS, the predecessor to today's Central Intelligence Agency, really did recruit the nation's most bookish types to become secret agents in dangerous undercover missions abroad. These were missions that required their knowledge and love of books, just as a fighter pilot's mission requires a knowledge of planes. The book I wrote on the subject follows a small, interconnected group of people, but the OSS recruited hundreds of them, mild-mannered professors and oddball archivists and restless librarians. Because America had no standing intelligence agency at the start of the war, it needed to build up an instant bank of expertise on every subject in the library. The OSS simply raided the library for recruits. These bookish types were pulled into the Cloak and Dagger Brigade and trained, in the words of one contemporary, in all the black arts of mystery, deception, and mayhem. Their adventures took them, and the saboteurs, swindlers, and human smugglers they found themselves suddenly collaborating with, to the covered bazaars of Istanbul, a secretive legation in Stockholm, a salt mine in Austria, a seedy cafe in Marseille, an impossibly posh spy training camp near London, a deception training camp outside of Los Angeles that might as well have been a studio lot, a power plant hidden in the snowy mountains of Norway that the Nazis were using in a scheme to develop a secret weapon. But above all, their adventures took them through the world of books. Because I knew there would be book lovers here today, I brought a few examples of books to show you virtually. These books are all from the period of World War II, and they're all meaningful to World War II, especially the period spycraft, because of some aspect of their bookishness. The first example that I'll give you, is this book, My 3 Years with Eisenhower. Turn the video off again. By Harry Butcher. This was published in 1946, just after the end of the war. At the time, a lot of aspects of the war were still classified, including the code names of the big military operations. So Operation Fortitude, for instance, a deception operation that disguised the preparations for the D-Day landings by making it look like the Allies wanted to land in Norway, not France. That code name was still classified. Nobody was supposed to know what it was. Nobody was supposed to know about the Fortitude operation either. Some of these secrets remained classified for decades. Now, the first lesson about spycraft that I want to teach you is secrets aren't secure. If you have assets or information that you want to hide from others, you should try as much as possible to keep whatever system used to hide those assets from depending on secrets like code names or passwords, because people are terrible at keeping secrets, which is demonstrated by this book. It was written by a former aide of General Dwight Eisenhower, who knew all about Fortitude, and before it was published, U.S. intelligence went through it and cut out every reference to Fortitude. But they forgot to check the book's index. So you see, there it is, the secret got out. Books can reveal all kinds of things if you just know how to use them. Let's go back to the beginning. One day in early 1942, government agents marched into the New York Public Library and demanded to see its collections of maps. The same scene was playing out at libraries all over the country. A librarian at UCLA later recalled hearing stories from his elders of coming to work and finding that the map library had suddenly become a 24-hour armed security area protected by guards. These agents were probably members of Research and Analysis, which was the intelligence analysis division of the OSS, the predecessor to today's Central Intelligence Agency. At the time, R&A agents were hunting through libraries and confiscating all kinds of books: travel books, phone books, scientific books, industry directories, even sometimes novels. But maps provide an especially potent example as to why. In 1941, when the United States entered the war, the US had just 2 sets of maps showing all of Japan. You need maps in order to fight a war. If you have soldiers landing on the shore of some town in North Africa, you need to know what the roads are into and out of town, where you might be ambushed by retreating. Libraries were utterly deficient. They'd been taking for granted that if professors, let's say, really wanted to look at a source, they could go to Europe. But after the war started, of course, that wasn't possible. The military was deficient too. The Army Corps of Engineers, which had been making most of the maps the military used, had a budget before the war that provided for 2 cartographers. Because of this, during the war, making maps was a huge component of the work of R&A geographers who passed endless hours copying historical maps in the New York Public Library. They drew situation maps every day for the War Department. They drew reference maps and thematic maps to accompany the reports that R&A wrote at the request of military and government officials. They drew maps to propose strategic elements of upcoming military operations. And they used in ingenious ways whatever maps they could get their hands on, maps that were never meant to be used in war. This map, for instance, which is a whaling map that the Wilkes expedition published in the 19th century. It's a copper plate engraving. The surveyors got their measurements by firing guns from their ships and listening for the echo. Herman Melville used it while writing Moby Dick. Not ideal lumber for the age of radar. This is what they had to work with. And remarkably, they made it work. So, lesson 2 of spycraft. It's a lesson that professors know all too well. The answers might be right in front of you, but you won't see them unless you do the reading. Nothing in the library is unimportant. I'm now going to show you some other maps from the period. This is an atlas that R&A geographers used in war planning. I don't know whether it was this specific book, but they used this atlas. It was from 1922. Now, R&A agents worked at the New York Public Library, but they also worked in Rockefeller Center, which was the OSS headquarters in New York City. So if you can imagine a boy, they used very young couriers because nobody suspects children, running up 6th Avenue from the New York Public Library to Rockefeller Center, carrying to the amusement of everyone he passes an atlas so large that it might as well be a table. This is Sweden on $50, which is a guidebook for tourists. You'll note that it contains a map. Guidebooks often did. And this is a tourist's guide to Istanbul, which again contains maps. They fold out right here. So books like these also had other very valuable information, like where are the train tracks that you might need to sabotage during a battle to keep Axis reinforcements from arriving. Here, is another book, just a street directory for Casablanca, that contains, if you just look, street addresses for every Casablanca business that you need to sabotage or occupy. Matériel de chemin de fer, that's railway equipment. Société Française de Munitions de Chasse de Tir et de Guerre, that's French for munitions factory. All the post, telegraph, and telephone offices that could give up the whole goose. The Electric Works, the Red Cross Pharmacy, a full map of every borough, port, and railroad that runs from Morocco to France. Everything you need, hidden in plain sight at the New York Public Library. Now, the OSS also sent professors and librarians abroad on secret undercover missions. In the book, I focus on a small but connected group of these library rats turned unlikely spies. They include Joseph Curtis, a literature professor who hunted down German spies and turned them into double agents, and Adele Kuyber, an archivist who was sent to Stockholm to secretly acquire documents for the OSS. Although he stayed in Washington, I also want to mention Sherman Kent, a smart-mouthed history professor who rose to become the head of intelligence analysis for all of Europe and Africa. We'll come back to him later. Let's suppose that it's 1942, and you've been pulled out of your library to become a spy. And it did happen like that. You'd get a call at the library, or a government agent would show up at the door to your classroom while you were teaching, or someone would come to recruit you during a school football game when nobody would notice another alumni-looking dude walking around campus in a suit. How do they teach you, who have no actual fighting experience, to be a spy? First, they'd send you to training camp. So, Joseph Curtis, literature professor at Yale. One day in August 1942, the head of his department paid him a visit in his faculty apartment in a residential college. He said, listen, you have to go to the Yale Club in New York City tomorrow. You have to wear a purple tie. You're going to see a man light a cigarette and put it out. Talk to that man. He has a message for you. As ridiculous as it sounds, as much like a spy story as it sounds, that's how he got recruited. As it turns out, because the people training and recruiting these spies were often new to spycraft themselves, they got a lot of their ideas from spy fiction. Recruitment felt straight out of a spy novel because that's where they got their playbook. As the book historian Robert Darnton says, literature doesn't just reflect history. Literature creates history. So you'd recognize your mysterious contact because he was wearing a red carnation, or because he was holding a Penguin paperback with its distinctive orange cover. Or he might be holding a newspaper. Hold on, I got a newspaper, so I'm going to turn on the video for another second. Look, it's a newspaper from the period. And how he was holding the newspaper might be a signal. If the newspaper was sticking out of his overcoat pocket, it was safe to meet. If the newspaper was folded under his arm, he was being followed. And you should be sure, you should pretend not to know him. After you joined the OSS, you'd be sent to a spy training camp. The English had spy training schools that were incredibly posh. They were in country manners and had housemasters and servants and such. The Americans had camps with tents in national parks, which had terrain that could support combat exercises as well as enough seclusion to keep the goings-on secret. A totally different experience. But the English sent over their fighting instructors to teach the American spies how to fight. So you, as a professor, as a librarian, would be learning how to do the kind of close combat that leaves the other person not injured, but dead. So here's one of their close combat manuals. Sorry, it's called Kill or Get Killed. I have a few of these. And look, it's got little diagrams. These manuals assume that in the field, you will not have a weapon on you. If you're a spy, you can have either a cover story or a weapon, but you can't have both. If the Gestapo arrests you and you have a shoe that turns into a phone or a lipstick that turns into a gun, they're not going to believe that you're just a civilian. So you were taught how to use ordinary objects as weapons, how to kill someone with a newspaper, how to restrain someone with their own trousers. You also learned how to take weapons from other people, but the assumption was that you'd be out in the field with only your wits to protect you. This wasn't like James Bond with all his cool gadgets. After his training, Joseph Curtis went to Istanbul. Adele Kuyper went to Stockholm. Her job was to acquire documents that the Allies could use to develop intelligence and plan covert operations. Because a war was happening, you could no longer get things like newspapers or books or scientific journals from Germany or other Axis countries, not if you were in the United States. And as ingenious as the library rats were who were working with existing materials in the New York Public Library and elsewhere, there was still a pressing need to supplement their work by secretly acquiring documents abroad. Sweden was a neutral country, but it was filled with German documents. The Germans very badly wanted Swedes to believe that Americans were ruffians who had no concept of culture, that if they won, they would tear down the libraries and concert halls of Europe. And so the Germans sent to Stockholm, as proof of their own culture with a K, professors to give lectures wearing little round glasses, conductors to wave batons over performances of the magic flute. They made sure their scientific and technical journals flowed without wartime interruption into Stockholm's libraries and universities so that Swedish intellectuals would understand that scientific progress spoke the German language. This was a gap in the German defenses that Kuyper could take advantage of. Even though Sweden was a neutral country, Kuyper had to work undercover. Sweden had made a deal with the warring countries that it could maintain its neutrality as long as no spies operated in Sweden. Moreover, Sweden's sentiments tilted toward the Axis. The Swedish police were aligned with the Gestapo and had even trained with the Gestapo. If a spy was caught by the Swedish police, they faced arrest, imprisonment, deportation, even Gestapo-style beatings and interrogations. Sweden was neutral, but it wasn't impartial, and it was far from a safe place to be a spy. But Kuyper had, without knowing it, been training her whole life for exactly this mission. Kuyper had a PhD in classics from the University of California, Berkeley, and because women couldn't really go into the professoriate in those years, she became a professional archive hunter, hopping from archive to archive across Europe, earning money by taking photographs of rare texts for scholars back home in the States, who didn't have, in those days before the internet, any other way of seeing such texts besides visiting the archives themselves. By the time she was recruited by the OSS, she had been doing this for almost a decade. Kuyper's cover in Stockholm was that she was looking for books to add to the collections of the Library of Congress. Normal books, nothing to do with intelligence. Another rule of spycraft: a spy has to perform their cover as competently as the spycraft, which means if someone is pretending to work for a library, it's best that she has experience working with libraries. She acquired and secretly sent home on microfilm all kinds of documents that she should not have gotten access to. Industry directories, trade magazines, railway schedules, German newspapers, atlases, maps, technical journals, German newsletters that were on a restricted list and only went to certain vetted subscribers, underground resistance literature, privately printed books, books that had been printed by underground presses, and books that the German government had designated secret books and pulled from circulation, current newspapers, as well as back copies dating to 1940, publications on aeronautics, banking, bibliography, electronics, governance, finance, international relations, labor, law, legislation, metallurgy, mining, politics, regulation, shipbuilding, statistics, synthetic petroleum, and scientific publications of every description. Here is one of those industry directories. It's a Berlin industry directory from 1942. Very pleased to have this one. And if you're asking what's the use of a Berlin industry directory? It was used to find the addresses of the factories that produce ball bearings. And if you're asking why did they need the addresses of the factories that produce ball bearings were used to manufacture fighter planes and tanks and gun carriages and all the moving parts of Hitler's war machine. If you bomb a factory that makes fighter planes, you've only disabled a factory that makes fighter planes. But if you bomb a factory that makes ball bearings, you've disabled all the factories that use ball bearings to make other things, including the factory that makes fighter planes. Here's some ball bearings from World War II. It's amazing what you can find on eBay. I'm not kidding when I say that a whole subplot of World War II consisted of trying to get hold of ball bearings. Khyber was a rare and extraordinary talent. She was the most productive document acquisitions agent of the war. And when you ask, how did she get so good at this? I'd like you to consider that libraries are not only places to hide information, to reveal information, not only places to store information, they are places to hide information. For example, in the 18th century, a historian named Edmund Malone was writing a biography of Shakespeare, and he put in all of this stuff that he assumed to be true about what playwriting was like in Shakespeare's time. And then, just before his book goes into print, he finds in a library the original diary of an Elizabethan playwright named Philip Henslowe, and he learned that a lot of the stuff that he thought about playwriting in Shakespeare's time wasn't true. So he didn't pull his book from print. He didn't rewrite the biography, he just didn't return the diary to the library. It was returned after his death. I can give other examples. There's a university in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the faculty of the English department take turns going into the library and reshelving a novel that contains juicy gossip about the English department so that nobody can find it. Or again, at the National Archives, the catalog for OSS records was made with the help of OSS veterans. This was a good service to history, but they often cataloged the names of men and not the names of women, which means that women's papers are in the archive, but their names aren't findable in the catalog. Or again, for decades, women who have gone to do research at the Vatican archives, where you speak to church officials who decide your access to the books, have advised each other that you get better treatment if, when you go to speak to the church officials, you take off your wedding ring. In short, the work of getting archives to reveal their secrets requires a far more complicated set of moves than simply going to the shelf or looking at the catalog. It can require the work of a real bibliographic detective. Adele Khyber understood this. She went to the Vatican archives herself in her pre-war life as a freelance archive hunter. In 1940, when she asked to see an especially rare manuscript in the Vatican archives, an attendant was horrified, in the words of a contemporary account. He explained that only a certain cardinal could grant such permission. Miss Khyber immediately asked to see the cardinal. This horrified the attendant even more. Unfazed, Khyber, the daughter of movie set designers, sent a tempting card of introduction up to His Eminence. Miss Adele Khyber, Hollywood, California. A minute later, the attendant came down looking abashed. The cardinal had sent for her, saying, "So, you are from Hollywood. Come, let's talk." She amused the cardinal with an hour and a half of gossip about studio intrigue, and then she got the blessing she needed to see the manuscript. We'll move now to Joseph Curtis, but the last thing I want to mention about Khyber is that she was working a lot of different people and crafting a different persona for each. She went around to the library for Sweden's Royal Institute of Technology, the Karolinska Institute Bibliotek, the oldest medical library in Stockholm, which held all manner of medical journals, as well as a marvelous archive of rare books, the library for the Royal Veterinary College of Sweden, which had the medical books that the Karolinska Institute didn't, Civil Statistics Office, and all kinds of local libraries, because you never know when a book will wash up on the hidden shore of some neighborhood library nobody bothered to check. She made friends with librarians, which is evident from the huge numbers of books that she started to send back in microfilm to the OSS with the notation confidentially borrowed. She made friends with rare book dealers. Here are some catalogs by those dealers. And she convinced the book dealers who were on the side of the Germans that she was on the side of the Germans as well. She was rumored to have slipped into occupied France on a fishing boat. She made friends with the Norwegian underground. A real example of how little daylight there is between a good library rat and a good spy. Okay, Joseph Curtis. He taught literature at Yale. He was very much a hothouse flower. He was born and died in the same house, which people only do if they're very poor or very wealthy. He was very wealthy. He went to Yale for undergrad, then for grad school, then became a professor there. Had a very genteel, very cozy, very safe little life of letters. And then he was pulled out of that life, trained as a spy, and thrown into wartime Istanbul. Turkey, like Sweden, was neutral territory, but each country sustained neutrality in the war by following opposite policies on espionage. The Swedish government asked the warring countries how Sweden could stay out of the war, and the reply was that Sweden could remain neutral if it let nobody's spies operate in its territory. The Turkish government asked the warring countries how Turkey could stay out of the war, and the reply was that Turkey could remain neutral if it let everybody's spies operate in its territory. Turkey agreed. And so, although spies were running around in both countries, the spies in Stockholm had to work totally underground, whereas Istanbul was a world where everyone was presumed to be a spy. 17 different spy agencies operated in Istanbul. Their agents often sat at adjoining restaurant tables, trying to eavesdrop on each other's conversation while the waiter eavesdropped on them both. In a world like that, your cover is more important, not less. Curtis's cover was that he was a Yale professor who had been sent to Istanbul to collect books for Yale's library. He went around to the city's bookshops, taught a few classes at a local university. This is a picture of Istanbul's old book bazaar, which is just off the Grand Bazaar and is a very beautiful place. His actual job was to hunt down German spies and turn them into double agents. The story of how he fell into this job has a lot of twists and turns. He was supposed to have a job like Khyber's, document hunting, but the Istanbul outpost of the OSS imploded just before he got there because the outpost director thought he was James Bond and was sleeping with his sources, and his sources turned out to be enemy agents. The guy's cover was broken so thoroughly that every time he went into one of the city's nightclubs, the band would start playing a song called Boo Boo Baby, I'm a Spy. It was an unmitigated disaster, and the guy didn't even see why it was an unmitigated disaster. Curtis was supposed to set up his cover and wait for somebody in the Istanbul outpost to contact him, but nobody did. After a while, he got tired of waiting and found the outpost director by himself. By that point, the OSS brass had discovered just how badly the outpost was leaking and was hauling most of the agents involved home to the States by the scruffs of their necks. The director, Lanning McFarland, was holding on to his own position by his fingernails. Anyway, McFarland, perhaps realizing that he was dealing with a motivated detective, or perhaps deciding to cover his embarrassment at being found by dumping on the finder a huge task that was sure to embarrass him, or perhaps just understaffed and desperate, responded to Curtis's sudden appearance by giving him surprising new orders. Curtis was told to build a local chapter of the X2 counter-espionage section of the OSS to replace the group of agents that was just fired. How? Just do it. You'll figure it out. X2 stands for double cross. It's a very important branch of spycraft. You want, as far as possible, not to destroy the enemy's spy networks, but to keep them in place and turn them so they work for you. And Curtis, totally unexpectedly, turned out to be very good at this. There's a lot of intrigue and backstabbing in academia, but this was something else altogether. His greatest moment came during the lead up to the Normandy invasion. At that time, the Allies were engaged in what you could call a ghost war. They were using every trick possible to confuse the Nazis as to where and when the invasion would be. Hollywood got involved, building whole decoy battalions and sending actors out to pretend to be soldiers and generals. From London to Marseille to Istanbul to Stockholm, spies burned their covers, worked up dazzling distractions, told more extravagant lies than they'd ever dared, and sent false information through double agents. The latter was Joseph Curtis's job, but Curtis's unit didn't just turn enemy agents into double agents, it convinced many of them to become outright defectors. The defections were the real masterstroke of Istanbul's X2 agents. So many German Abwehr agents in Istanbul defected that Hitler, enraged, fired the head of the agency, who until now had been Hitler's chief of intelligence, and then dissolved the Abwehr altogether, moving its agents into a police intelligence organization that had a totally different way of doing things. It was a drastic move at the worst possible time for the Germans. Right when the Allies were preparing for what everyone agreed might well be the decisive battle of the war, Hitler started making major changes to his intelligence system, destabilizing the Nazis' flow of intelligence. After the war, history would sing the praises of the double-cross system for its successes in maneuvering the Germans to play the game as the Allies wanted. But the double-cross unit in Istanbul managed to achieve something truly remarkable. It convinced Hitler to remove some of his own pieces from the board. I want to say a few words quickly about Sherman Kent, who was a history professor and a friend of Joseph Curtis at Yale, who rose to become the head of intelligence analysis for all of Europe and Africa. Handsome devil, as you can see from these pictures. Intelligence analysis represented something new in the world of spycraft. The research and development branch of the OSS, which employed researchers in the applied sciences, chemistry, engineering, fields that prepared one to build weapons and spy gear, was a long-established type of institution in other countries. But Kent's branch, research and analysis, which pulled researchers from university departments in the humanities and social sciences, had no equivalent in other spy agencies. These were the people who were working in the New York Public Library, in the basement of the Library of Congress, in temporary plywood buildings all over Washington. I also want to mention that this was an incredibly diverse group. There were Black analysts, there were Jewish analysts. They were willing to pull in anybody who was talented in order to do this work for them. The historians, philologists, psychologists, economists, and other humanists of R&A permanently changed the world of spycraft. They proved that, in Sherman Kent's words, well-trained scholars can find out 90% of what an intelligence agency needs to know without even looking at secret sources. You just have to know how to do the reading. Sherman Kent was actually the perfect man for his job because his job entailed, in part, trying to convince the military to listen to what those tweedy professors were saying. And Kent, although he was himself a tweed-wearing professor, really should have been a drill sergeant. He was brilliant, but he was always looking for a fight. When he was teaching, he would throw chalk past the heads of his students, which they don't let us do anymore. And after he went to a spy training camp and learned how to throw daggers, he became so good at it that for the rest of his career, he was famous for being able to, quote, throw a knife better than a Sicilian. He was also a man of superb and outrageous profanity, and he could talk to the generals in their own language. All the work of the professors and librarians would have been nothing if he hadn't been their spokesman. After the war, Kent left academia and became the head of intelligence analysis for a new agency called the CIA. He wanted to prove to his colleagues that, as I said, well-trained scholars can find out 90% of what an intelligence agency needs to know. So he asked a group of Yale historians to spend the summer in Yale's library, reading through publicly available documents and working out, using those documents alone, closely guarded military secrets. They succeeded at the task. Just for fun, they formatted the report so that it looked like it was a Russian report. This was a stupid idea. The report they produced got leaked to Congress, which panicked because it thought that Yale professors were finding out military secrets for the Russians, and everybody got in a lot of trouble. An official from the CIA presented himself at the Yale Library and attempted to confiscate the library's entire contents. The librarians managed to convince him to take only the papers of the historians involved. It was a very silly episode, but Kent did prove he was right. Okay, so World War II changed the world in a lot of ways. It also changed the world of books. If you pick up a book that was published during World War II, the first thing you're likely to notice is that it feels very light, like a hollow prop, not as heavy as you'd expect a book of its size to be. The war created a paper shortage that forced American publishers to change the paper they were using to a much thinner, lighter stock. The situation was far worse in Europe. Public debates arose in Britain as to whether the government should start ransacking the nation's archives for paper. Here's another book, also printed on very light stock. This is an armed services edition of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The books in this series were selected by the Council of Books on Wartime and distributed to the troops. The Great Gatsby wouldn't be The Great Gatsby if not for World War II. Fitzgerald at the time was in what the kids would call his flop era. In 1940, the total sales for all of Fitzgerald's books was a whopping 72 copies. The total scholarly articles about his books could be counted in single digits. The Armed Services editions got 155,000 copies of Gatsby into the hands of readers. But more importantly, the Armed Services editions proved to publishers that the paperback format works. After the war, Gatsby was reissued in all kinds of paperback imprints, and readers realized what a classic it was. Without paperbacks, there is no Gatsby. It's just not in the canon. The fate of literature is inextricable from the fate of books. That's not in the spy book. I just think it's cool. Here is something that's in the spy book. This is the last, and in some ways, the most successful intelligence operation of the war. In early 1945, when a small and very secretive group of people knew the atom bomb would be ready to drop before the year was out, Vannevar Bush, the head of an agency in charge of coordinating war research at U.S. universities, summoned a Princeton professor named Henry DeWolf Smythe to a meeting in Washington. Bush asked Smythe, whose specialty was physics and who served as an advisor for the Manhattan Project, to write an account of the atom bomb, how it worked, how it was built, that could be given to the general public. This is that account. It was ready to go when atom bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. It was an immediate bestseller. Just for your amusement, I am also going to show you the other book that was at the top of the bestseller lists in August of 1945. If you have children, you need to cover their eyes. All right, so this is Henry DeWolf Smythe's book, and this is the other book that was at the top of the bestseller lists in that period. It's got a naked woman on the cover, which I think accounts for its bestseller status. So these two were neck and neck, basically, right? The reason the government, some books fell. The reason the government asked Smythe to write his book was this. They knew that once the atom bomb was known to the world, the public would clamor for the story behind the weapon. And someone, a reporter or a scientist who hadn't signed secrecy documents, would provide it, unless the government told the story first. Smythe's book controlled the narrative. It was written to shape people's ideas of the atom bomb in such a way that other countries would find it harder to build one. Now, specifically what the book did was it told a story about physicists and almost solely about physicists. It told the Oppenheimer story that you've seen in the movies. The government knew that the physics of building an atom bomb was the easiest part to figure out from first principles, and also, from a certain perspective, the least important part. Far more important, at least for solving the problem of how to make the damned thing work. The problem of building an atom bomb is how to sustain fission while the bomb is exploding. And to do that, they needed the heroic labors of chemists and engineers and metallurgists and technicians in Chicago and Los Alamos, who then had their contributions swept from history. Today, a popular term for World War II is the physicists' war, which just goes to show what a triumph this operation was. It was a misinformation coup so successful that it still utterly dominates the way we think of the atom bomb today. After the war, physics departments found themselves the beneficiaries of soaring enrollments, a flood tide of government funding, and the kind of attention normally afforded to Hollywood stars. After all, everyone knew that the war was, at bottom, a triumph of physicists. What I want to remind you, though, and this is my last lesson of spycraft, is that in matters worthy of great intelligence security, what everyone knows merits a little healthy skepticism. Like I told you earlier, secrets aren't secure. A better way to protect an asset than to just keep it secret is to spread misinformation. So, what I've been arguing to you is that this wasn't just the physicists' war. It was the historians' war, the book collectors' war, the artists' war. It was the professors' war. The war was fought on battlefields, but it was won in libraries. The librarians and professors that I've been talking about, and the intelligence analysis that emerged as a product of their work, represented something new in the world of intelligence. The United States invented intelligence analysis during World War II because it didn't have a standing intelligence agency and had to turn that disadvantage into an advantage by inventing something new. So it invented the concept of these men and women, book boffins who were grabbed right out of libraries and universities, sitting in the basement of the Library of Congress and working on problems that at first glance might seem laughably trivial. What's the best number of pellets to put in an anti-aircraft shell? What parts of a plane are worth reinforcing with extra rubber? What percentage of rubber in German tank tires is synthetic? But here's the thing. The answers to those questions changed the course of the war. These men and women showed that working on supposedly small problems can yield big results. The thing about world-changing discoveries is they don't always come in world-shaking forms. So you learn about how they did their sideways thinking and how they pulled their intelligence out of incredibly unlikely sources in the library. Intelligence analysis became the foundation of modern spycraft. So spectacular were their contributions that they changed the future of intelligence. And the United States recognized this. Before the war, US libraries were in their flop era, underfunded, very thin collections in comparison to what was available in Europe, because the assumption had always been that if you needed something, you could just go to Europe, which of course turned out not to be the case in wartime. After the war, both university libraries and public libraries were heavily invested in by the US government, which was determined to never be caught so badly lacking again. The US had learned the value of libraries, not just as centers of community and education, but as something that's integral to national security. The question you tend to be asked after you write a book like this is, how did ordinary people find the courage to fight against this huge fascist regime? What I have learned, and what I believe, is that only ordinary people can fight this kind of fight. Or, to be more tactical about it, the kinds of people whom Hitler would dismiss or overlook, like women or Jewish people, Black people, refugees, factory workers, professors — he didn't think much of professors — were exactly well positioned to run sabotage campaigns or get information from people. Most informants don't know they're informants. Or steal from libraries in Europe scientific books and journals, the latest research on atomic physics, that they could send to the library at a little place in New Mexico called Los Alamos. These ordinary people, precisely by being ordinary people, with a lot of courage, helped to give the Allies their greatest victories. During the D-Day invasion, German reinforcements could very easily have traveled to the Normandy coast and just wiped out the Allied soldiers in what was already a very difficult battle for the Allies to win. The reason the reinforcements didn't come is that a few hours before D-Day, ordinary people who belonged to the French resistance heard a code phrase over the radio and then went outside and destroyed more than 900 sections of railroad. So the trains couldn't get to the Normandy coast. This huge battle depended on these ordinary people. Which brings me to my last point. One of the things I've learned while writing this book is that what you have is what you bring to the war. When your back is against the wall, you don't come up with something new. You fall back on your training. The English had spy training schools that were incredibly posh. They were in these country manors and had housemasters and servants and such because they were English. That's what they knew, so that's what they fell back on. The Americans had camps with tents where they were training people how to do quick draws like cowboys because they were Americans, so of course they trained like cowboys. The Norwegians were out there on skis. The French resistance robbed liquor stores, drank the wine, and then turned the wine bottles into Molotov cocktails. Because they're French, they fought as the French do. The librarians also fell back on their training, and it turned out to be, unexpectedly, exactly what modern intelligence needed. But more than this, the reserves of courage that ordinary people found to win a war against the Reich came from their love and values and struggles that they had before the war. Many of them were doing things like helping refugees before their country got into the war, or they were protesting Hitler's burning of books. The values they learned in peacetime in places like libraries gave them courage during the war, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited to be bringing out a book that argues that protecting our libraries is a national security issue. What you have is what you bring to the war. What we have in libraries is precious and irreplaceable. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting. So
Thank
now
you.
we will take any questions that folks have. I know I see Barry has a question if you wanted to come off mute and ask that.
Okay, I'm off mute, right?
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah, one of my questions is when these people were recruited and sent in to do all these things, how did they pull a salary? Were they given a stack of francs that said go do it, or how did they get paid? Or were they paid? I assume they were.
It depended on what their cover was. So, for instance, Joseph Curtis's cover was that he was going abroad for Yale University's library. Yale University paid him his salary. Yale University didn't know that he went abroad to be a spy. Yale's library knew that he went abroad to be a spy and was using funds that it got from Walter Forsheimer, who's funded a lot of libraries across the United States and was working as a money launderer for the OSS. Anyway, I'm a big fan of the Forsheimers, but that's a conversation for another day. So, in fact, the fact that Yale didn't know what Joseph Curtis was up to and only Yale's library did became an issue when he went up for tenure after the war, because they were like, why haven't you published anything during the past few years? We can't give you, and the CIA had to call Yale and be like, we can't tell you what he did during the war, but you have to give him tenure. It was very funny, but okay. But as agents, yeah, they were given a stack of francs. And again, a lot of people were involved in making those francs available. Hollywood did a lot of money laundering for the OSS during the war. Hollywood was operating in different countries and therefore could change cash in one currency into cash in another currency. And they would just say, oh, we're scouting for a picture that's happening in this country. They did some amazing work. There were fake bills, obviously, that were made. And then there was a lot of subterfuge used to make them look like exactly perfect in terms of how wrinkled they were. So millions of dollars, millions of francs would be spread out in bills on the floor of one of the OSS office buildings, let's say, and the secretaries would simply walk across the money all day while they did their work. And that would, it turned out, perfectly wrinkle the bills so that they looked authentic. Istanbul, one of the reasons that all of the warring countries wanted spies to operate openly in Istanbul is like the major crossroads of the world. So it was also a perfect place to change money. The long and short of it is there were a lot of sneaky ways that the OSS got money to people, but the ones who were undercover were drawing salaries according to their ordinary cover.
Thank you. And looks like we also have a question from Greg.
Elise, thank you for the presentation. Your focus was on the Atlantic Theater specifically. Do you have any
Yes.
stories about the Pacific Theater?
I wish I had more stories about the Pacific Theater. It just happened to be the case that the small group of spies that I was focusing on, the little friend group, happened to be working in the Atlantic Theater. So I didn't get the opportunity to spend as much time looking into what was happening in the Pacific Theater. One of the things that I regret about missing out on that is, for instance, I don't think it's controversial historically to say that Tokyo Rose was working for the Americans, or at least she was working on her own for the Americans. When she read her propaganda, it was always in a very ironic way and with little laughs and things like that. She was basically forced to do her job. She was an American, I don't know what you would call it. She was studying abroad in the United States, went back to Japan. She happened to get there at the wrong time, which is when Pearl Harbor happened, so she couldn't get back to the United States, and she had to do this propaganda work. But she was on her own working for the American side while she did that. But after the war, an individual journalist really wanted to write a story about this sultry, seductress spy from the East who was trying to get innocent milk drinking American men. You know what I mean? So he interviews her and then he writes this story about her, and that becomes sort of the story about who she was. But it was just that, a story. And there was no way to fit that into the book, but I read her stuff and I listened to her broadcasts and I looked at, the historical material, and I felt kind of bad for her. Just an instance of somebody who, one of the things that spies weaponize is the intrigue of storytelling about spycraft. There were instances during World War II when somebody needed to get the help of a civilian, and they sort of played it up. Like, you've been dropped into this glamorous spy story. Don't you want to have this impossibly glamorous moment in your life? And usually the civilians went along with it because of course you'd want to. But that's a double-edged sword. And if you've been caught as a spy, people think that you are, this Veronica Lake-haired seductress who's out to do evil, because that is the story about spies, and especially women spies. And so, you get lined up against a wall and shot. It's tough to be in, what do I want to say, the world's second oldest profession, but definitely the world's most glamorous profession.
Thank you. I have a follow-up one too, since I'm going to be asked anyway about it. You mentioned Istanbul and you mentioned Stockholm. Well, Lisbon
Yes.
was another place. Madrid
Yes.
to a lesser extent. Any Lisbon stories?
The librarians in Lisbon were up to amazing things, but I decided to stay away from that place precisely for that reason, because somebody else was working on a book about it, and I didn't want to invade someone else's territory. So Kathy Pice would be the person to look out for in terms of future books about the librarians of Lisbon.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Elise. Really fascinating. I'm just thinking about when we teach in liberal arts department, humanities department, we're sort of always under the attack to say we're sort of our upper administrations always think about STEM, right? Yeah, and to think it's like more important things. But I think your book was teaching me this kind of a close reading that we teach our students in literature classes in how to read a visual text, do the kind of the critical thinking, and that can be really hopeful. So I just want to see how to take advantage of your book, and just say like we do train students in like useful skills and related can be related to national security and things like that. And then I don't know, maybe this for Elise and also for everybody, just brainstorm the things like we always have to argue for our existence. I know the languages definitely play a very important part. So so that was my question.
They might, hugely useful and valuable skills. And this is something that's not unknown. You know what I mean? Like, how do I put this? Billionaires are not raising their children to be AI dependent. You know what I mean? McKinsey, D.E. Shaw, these, financial firms, they are hiring out of humanities departments at Ivy League universities. I mean, specifically the art historians, the literature, graduating seniors, that sort of thing. And that's because there is a kind of thinking and a kind of research and a kind of, I'm going to say, endurance that you learn, when you work in these disciplines. You learn a way of thinking that, yeah, later on can be applied to just making a whole bunch of money. But it can also be applied to winning wars, intelligence analysis came out of United States humanities departments, and it was such a powerful method that it changed the way people all over the world did spycraft. My worry is that I mentioned the glamour and romance of spy stories. My worry is that the glamour and romance of those stories, stories about Ethan Hunt, jet setting around the world, punching bad guys in the face, that politicians are going to forget that those are movies and that is not how spycraft is really done. And they'll defund everything else and just say, hey, let's get some Ethan Hunt guys out there to punch people in the face, which is not how good intelligence is done. You know what I mean? Spies weaponize stories about spies, but intelligence itself, as a method of analysis, is endangered by spy stories. Like I said, quoting Bob Darton, literature doesn't just reflect upon history. Literature creates history. We're created by the books that we read or the books that we don't read, as much as we sort of create ourselves independent of that. Anyway, long story short, I think libraries are hugely important, should be invested in massively, and that any digitization projects that take place, which I am in support of, should never be accompanied by destroying the original materials, because at some point you're going to defund the server and that information is getting lost anyway, or the disks will demagnetize or whatever. As soon as you start destroying the paper, you've lost the stuff forever. It's a completely separate matter, I guess.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. So Ashley had a question. I know you talked about how people would just be kind of pulled out of their library or their university to be wished up for training.
Yeah.
But what do we know about how the government identified people to begin with? Because I imagine that they had to be pretty sure that the people they were whisking off were going to work out, because they couldn't afford, since we were in a war, to go too far down the road with people who wouldn't have the physical and mental fortitude to complete the training and then go off on their missions.
Yeah, so that's partly what the spy training schools were for. Like they would put you through it. And the intention was to find out if you had, if you had latent PTSD or something like that, that was going to set you off in an interrogation situation. You were going through mock interrogations in which you were told you were going to be tortured. You weren't tortured, but you were put through interrogation. Well, you did like, you would hold your hands above your head. You did stress positions. I'm not saying that's not torture. That is torture. It was not Gestapo style torture, but you were told, anyway, you were put through the ringer, and over the course of your training, which could take, depending on whether you were just sticking around in Washington as an analyst or actually going out in the field, it could take 1 week to many months. You could be moved from one camp to another to learn different specialties. During that time, you were watched very closely by people who were often themselves in real life psychologists, and they would take note of your strengths and weaknesses, and they created a report card for you, just like in school, where they said, okay, here are the skills that this person is good at. Here are the skills that this person is bad at. And being a spy is, it's unlike in the movies, it's really granular. You do one thing and you do it really well. You are a book hunter and you do it really well. You are an analyst and you do it really well. You are a courier and you do it really well. That sort of thing. Like everything is very specific. They had something called whisperers, where your only job is to spread gossip, and specifically false gossip. And only trained whisperers could whisper. And the whispers came from somebody who was called the Master of Whispers, which I think is a pretty great job title. But anyway, so you would be given, they would find exactly what thing you were well suited for, unless you were washed out of the program, in which case you would be washed out of the program. But they would find the thing that you were well suited for, and they would put you in that role. So if you were someone who couldn't take a lot of physical risks, that's just not part of your constitution, you might be an analyst. And then the type of analysis you did would depend on your strengths. Do you speak Greek? Do you, there was a place called the Division of Economic Warfare in Manhattan, where they figured out that stuff about the ball bearings, they figured out all of this crazy stuff. And like I said, they were very diverse. They were very American. In the people that they took in. There were Black analysts working in the Division of Economic Warfare, and they did incredible work. You know what I mean? There were Jewish analysts working all over the place. 34% of the OSS was women, and they were not, they were working as real agents. A lot of the time out in the field, because the occupied cities of Europe were filled with women, the men having been conscripted to war or sent off to Germany to work in the factories. So if you were a man, you were at risk of being pulled in by the Germans. But if you were a woman, you were just another woman, So what I'm trying to say is this. They had methods, including especially the training, to make sure that you were suited for the work that you were sent out to do. And aside from that, so academia is a world where everybody knows way too much about everybody else. Right? We are all nosy people. We are all in each other's business. Okay. There is a reason that we wound up being such good spies. I am very sure that people provided information on their friends, on their colleagues, on their enemies as well, that affected the type of recruiting that went on.
Great. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have one more question. OSS didn't start until we actually entered the war, but was there a predecessor, and were they? It seems that we would have been doing this for 5 years.
Yeah. The COI, the Coordinator of Information, was put together before the US got into the war, and then it turned into the OSS later on. There was a period, the US had no standing intelligence agency at the start of the war. That is true. It didn't have like an agency that did the things that we would assume that an intelligence agency did. It was just like a group of guys in a building. William Donovan, who was the head of the COI, did incredible work pulling together the OSS. His great advantage was that he was a lawyer. Remember how I told you that spy stories influence real spycraft? One last instance of it, which is that William Donovan was portrayed in a movie about, I think, World War I. I forget the name of the movie. I think it had James Cagney in it, but he didn't play William Donovan. But it was this James Cagney movie. And the guy who played William Donovan was like, he was playing this like heroic guy, you know what I mean? Like smart, ready for a fight, kind of upstanding in the way that men used to be in American Hollywood movies. You know what I mean? Just like a figure of valor. And historians think that the president watched the movie and was like, I want that guy to be my coordinator of information, and just hired William Donovan. So he was hired because of the movie, probably. But he was a lawyer in real life. And what lawyers know is this: you have to do the reading. So he was like, give me the professors. They're going to do the reading for me. And it turned out to be the right decision. So again, stories influence the way that we act in real life. And the best that we can do is try to do the best we can with what stories, the path that stories have set us onto.
But this is Greg. I have another question. I
Of
always
course.
like to ask this of speakers. Why did you pick this topic? Because
What, this topic?
yeah, this particular, because you're obviously interested in a lot of different things. What got you interested in writing a book on librarians in World War II?
I'm glad that you asked that because I have a slide to help answer. Okay. Um, I keep this packed away in case I get this question. The woman on the far right is my grandmother. She started off as a dancing girl and she became a spy during World War II.
Cool.
That's
Yeah,
not the
she worked at,
Rockettes, is it?
it's not the Rockettes, it was just some World War II dancing girls. Um, uh, so I had already been interested in World War II intelligence, and having been in academia for a long time, I have a lot of inside knowledge about how it works. So I wrote a story for my college's alumni weekly about professors who were spies during World War II. Well, actually, about what happened after World War II, which is that they started recruiting students from humanities, literature and philosophy departments, history departments, to become the CIA. That's why the stereotype is that the CIA is like Yale history students. Anyway, and that changed the CIA a lot when the population of CIA employees changed from being Yale professors to Yale students, because those are two completely different types of people. But that's a story for another day. But that explains everything about the wartime OSS versus the CIA. Anyway, so I wrote this piece, and people really liked it. They wrote to me, they wanted to know more about it. And by then I was really hooked on the story too. So I kept going into it, and I'm really glad that I had the opportunity. I traveled all over the world to research this thing. I went to Istanbul, I went to Stockholm. I spent some time in England at there's the spy school in England. Former spy school. They don't actually train spies there anymore, but they have a very nice old car collection, so that families come visit because the dads want to see the car collection. Anyway, it was an adventure, and I tried to put as much of the adventure as possible into the book because I want people to read the book and be swayed by the argument about libraries, to be completely honest. I am trying to get some broccoli into some brownies here. I'm trying to get an argument that I know to be true, but is also dry, into a form that people will consume. And hopefully I was successful, and hopefully my grandmother, who passed this year actually, is happy with me.
I think personally, you ought to include that slide in your presentation right up front.
Agree.
And that would explain to people your own interest in it. But that's my
That's
two
true.
cents.
That's true. They had great legs back then too.
Well, it's an eye opener if nothing else.
Yes,
You
very
don't
much so.
lose your audience right away.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Guys,
Mhm.
Go
I
ahead.
have another question. If it's too, um, I was just thinking about from your research.
Yes.
Since I'm a language teacher, so did you see any values of like the kind of information that world languages people who
Yeah.
test
Yeah.
the
If you could,
proficiency in the languages?
so to put aside for a moment what's known as philology, which is like the careful study of the English language, which a lot of analysts did, because a lot of wartime research is, a lot of it was like reading, uh, reading the society pages in a foreign newspaper and finding out from little mentions in the society pages whether some German division is in town. You see what I mean? Finding out what the German morale is, what they're thinking about Hitler. You have whispers that you're trying to disseminate through the population. You need theories about communication in order to disseminate whispers through the population. Like there was a list of how you should do whispers. I put it in the book. I will note that it is exactly the set of rules that Twitter operates by, but that's a conversation for another day. You want to spread false information, you need to have theories about communication. So you need to be somebody who studies communication to formulate whispers. But also people who could speak other languages, and they were called linguists at the time because Noam Chomsky, wasn't around. They were the first people recruited to be spies. If you could speak another language, you were getting kidnapped off the street by the OSS and they were going to make you a spy. There was a whole group of people who were young people who had come from Europe as refugees, largely Jewish. And they came here as refugees and they turned right around and they trained at a place called Camp Ritchie and they went right back to serve as spies. They did a different kind of spycraft. They were traveling with the military and they were doing tactical rather than strategic spycraft, which is to say they were interviewing civilians as the army moved forward and they were figuring out answers to tactical questions. Tactical is what you do in the next hour, the next day. Strategic is what you do in the next week, the next month. So tactical questions, do we turn left or right? Are there people hiding up ahead who will ambush us? You know what I mean? So if you could speak another language, you could interview civilians. And also you could find out if those civilians were lying, you could find out, a lot of information that spies find out is information that is found through indirection, through implicature, through irony. Who understands how to decode these things? People who study languages. They spend all of their time saying, well, what Homer meant when he was doing this was kind of ironic because he was doing that. You know what I mean? They come up with whole theories about this stuff, and it really helps them to be careful and sensitive readers later on. And it's not coincidental that people who had gone off and trained as spies to read texts very carefully came back and resumed their posts as literature professors and invented methodologies in literary studies like close reading or new historicism or book history that were putting in action the ways that you read a text if you are actually a spy. This stuff wound up informing literary studies too. Post-literary studies is like post-World War II, post-war literary studies is post-World War II spycraft studies. These guys came back and they used all of their theories about reading in order to teach the next generation of students. So now it's very difficult to extricate that stuff from literary studies altogether. I don't know if it can be done. Anyway, long story short, without language, you've got nothing as far as spycraft and intelligence is concerned. Another example, you need, if you want to lie effectively, sociological theories about lying. You know what I mean? Like you need to study how people give themselves away when they lie, for example, by giving too many details, so that you can teach people not to do that. And we have transcripts of people training spies how to withstand interrogation. And you were told, like, when people lie, they do this, so you need to do this, that sort of thing. All of that came from sociology, it came from psychology, some of it came from literary studies, it came from studies of language. They didn't send people out in the field unprepared, and a lot of their preparation came from the study of language.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Guys, you've been a wonderful audience. It was such a delight to be talking to you. If you want, if you write to me, I will send you a quiz that you can take to figure out what kind of spy you would have been in World War II. I made one just for fun, and I'll send it to anybody who asks for it.
That's pretty fun.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, you should Yeah, just send one to us and maybe we'll
I
send it
will.
to everybody.
Yeah. All right,
Yeah.
fantastic.
So let's see. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to say, in my official capacity as president of the museum, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I thought it was extremely informative and full of the kind of detail that makes things meaningful. Um, but I think one of the things that your presentation makes points makes that are really important. Today everybody's talking about, AI and how AI is going to transform the workplace and replace people. But, for what I mean, AI is a tool, but what you discuss, I think it really emphasizes the human factor that
Yeah.
can't be replaced simply by an AI bot, something like that. And I think that's an important message in these days. People may not understand as much as they should about the human factor in doing this kind of sensitive work. So I think it's great research that you've done, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to hear your presentation. And I think it is very, very valuable information for people to have to understand the heritage that has come down, and a lot of the freedoms that we have now we owe to the people that did this kind of important and dangerous work, without questioning about it. So thank you
Yeah.
again for your presentation and all the work that you've done.
Thank you.